why don't we start with people we can start with social if people want to introduce yourselves and where you're connecting from and what interests you in tonight's topic.
We're gonna have to call on people, I think.
I'm gonna resist that for a little while. I know DLJ will speak up before too long if I don't call on him, so maybe not. Maybe I'll have to call on him.
Okay, all right. Well, first of all, an apology. I'm dressed in my school uniform because I'm doing a training course in about 30 minutes, so I'm not going to stay for long. But
no worries.
Yeah, thought experiments are, I think, incredibly useful generally. When are they not? Is when there's usually some sort of logical fallacy in there that makes you takes you in the wrong direction. I'm guessing. I assume that's where you're going to go, but we're going to find out. Oh, DLJ from the UK. Hi.
Great. Richard, how are you? Good to see you again. Good to see you too, DLJ.
Hey, I was wondering,
Yeah.
topic seems somehow against all conventions. The reason for Gedanken experiments is to clarify things.
It is, and what I'm going to talk about is why thought experiments actually, can sometimes muddle the waters instead of clarifying and lead you to the wrong conclusions instead of leading you to clarifying. I do agree that thought experiments are, when used correctly, they're there to help clarify things. But I think they are very often in philosophy used incorrectly, and used in such a way that they come to the wrong conclusions. And I'll give a very clear example of a sample thought experiment that shows that, and then I'll generalize it as a proof by contradiction. So good to see you, Richard. Who else wants to introduce themselves? And yeah, go ahead, Kerry.
I'll go. Okay. Name's Kerry. I am from Seattle, Washington at the moment. Always had an interest in philosophy, and boy, thought experiments are like our bread and butter. If there's a problem, I need to know what those are, right? And just get some guidance on how to make them appropriate if they're not, or at least more valid. And boy, if I can poke holes in somebody else's invalid ones, that'd be a great skill to have too.
Yeah, I think I'll give you a good technique for doing that. At least I hope I will, and you can tell me if I did or not. So who else wants to go?
I'll go.
Yeah.
Well, my name's Michael. I live in New Jersey. I attend almost all of these unless there's some situation which prevents me from doing so. And the main reason I'm interested tonight is because I've read a lot about the development of of quantum physics, relativity, and I know that Albert Einstein used to do a lot of thought experiments to come up with his theories. So I found the idea of thought experiments compelling, and I wanted to hear more about it.
Cool. They are very compelling and they are very useful, but I think they're sometimes misused, and I'll go into why with tangible example.
Garrett, Kiefer Sutherland is in the meeting.
Well, I don't think that's the actual Kiefer Sutherland, but
oh, okay. Just wanted to check. Thank you.
Yep.
You never know.
You never know. We may be more popular and more renowned than I expected.
Absolutely.
He says he's the real deal, but he's not on video, so we would love to see you on video, Kiefer. So who else wants to introduce themselves and where you're connecting from and what interests you in the topic?
I'll go.
Yeah.
Sarah, I'm in New York City in the Bronx. I don't know what the topic is tonight, but because it's on my calendar, so I just try and attend when I have time. So I'm just here, so I don't know exactly what we're covering tonight.
Cool. Well, unfortunately, we don't have another New York City event scheduled right now, but we will relatively soon. And if you want to send me your email, I'll put mine in the chat to add you to the New York City events. We do in-person events in New York City because I'm in the Jersey suburbs. tonight is about thought experiments and when they're useful and when they're not useful, which are sort of hypothetical situations. And you kind of have to decide what you would do in that hypothetical situation.
The comedian Stephen Wright once posed the questions, what if there were no hypotheticals?
I mean, the critical factor in a thought experiment is that everything's realistic except for you've got two alternatives, like one variable. One variable is the critical point.
That's what I would argue makes a good thought experiment, David, but that's not how they usually take form when I've seen them in philosophy essays, some of which are very famous. So I know that they're used in other circumstances very frequently. But David, you nailed it. That not to jump ahead to the punchline, but that is really more or less what I'm going to say. So if anyone thinks that they're done, you can leave now. But
okay. I'll go get some food. I'll be right
there you
back.
go. But if you want to hear the why, which some of us are very interested in the why, then I can go into the why. But that is really the takeaway. Go ahead, Katie. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I guess I'm thinking I don't quite understand the difference between a hypothetical and a thought experiment.
I don't think they're really different. Yeah, it's just a hypothetical scenario, a thought experiment. It's just that philosophers love to have their own set of names for things to make it seem like they're an exclusive club. Philosophers are not the only ones. Any PhD has their own, vocabulary where they use really complicated words that no one but the PhDs know to explain very simple thoughts. I try to say things in the very simple way, so I probably shouldn't have said thought experiments, but we're a philosophy community, so I did. But probably it would have been better to say when are hypothetical scenarios / thought experiments useful and not useful. But yeah, Katie, you're honing in on there's no real difference. Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Kelly from New Jersey, and I love to come, join your, this space because, you guys are always talking about very intriguing topics and, very interesting too. So I learn something, every time. Yeah, so I'm hoping, I really don't have any idea what today's topic we're gonna lead. So it's interesting to see.
Thank you, Kelly. It's great to see you again, and for the kind words. And I realized I need to. I mean, we kind of talked about what thought experiments are, but I should probably talk a little bit about what thought experiments are. So, who else wants to introduce themselves and a little bit about where you're coming in from and what interests you about thought experiments or hypothetical scenarios?
I'll go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dawn, Florida. My first meet up with a group and learn about philosophy and related and thought-provoking conversation. I think with thought experiment can get out of hand. I think just anything that humans get a hold of will take it too far.
Xin Chao. And thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. They get out of hand. And what I'm going to try to do is rein them in and basically make the case for what David said logically with a logical proof to support it. There was a famous paper to give an example. Well, I'll do it in the presentation. I'll see if there are any other people that want to say hi and where you're connecting from and what interests you. Joe, how are you?
Hey, how you doing?
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I'm Joe Bullock. I'm from outside Philadelphia, and we're, as I mentioned before, Garrett and I are actually looking into setting up a STOA. So with FTI, so I'm very excited about that, and I'm very excited about this meetup in particular. About the limitations of thought experiments, because I think sometimes the weight that they're given, especially in ethics, in the world of ethics, is that it doesn't necessarily match up with reality, but also in terms of how they are used within science as well. I think that there's limitations to them, and that they often cause people to come to conclusions that maybe aren't as well thought out as they could be.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And very much excited about starting a STOA with you, and hope people here that are interested in more Stoicism can get more Stoic wisdom from the STOA. I'm sure they'll be able to. And anyone else want to share?
Hey, I'm Kyle. I'm from San Diego, California, and I appreciate you letting me be a part of this intellectually stimulating conversation.
Thank you, Kyle. Good to have you. Mina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I'm Mina from Egypt, and I'm interested in deep conversations and philosophical discussions regarding anything at all.
Excellent. Well, we
So
cover a lot of anythings.
yeah, so that's why I joined, and since I'm trying to I started a new job and I'm trying to take off my mind of things. So the best way for that is to find something else to think about.
Definitely. Salam. David, did you want to say something else?
All I wanted to say, I haven't heard there's any Canadians here, so I thought, well, since other people are from like Egypt and California, I'm in
Canada
Toronto.
represent.
There you go. I'm part of. Well, I'm trying to. I don't know if it's a good representation or not, but I'm here for Canada. All right. We have philosopher. Actually, in Toronto, there's quite a number of philosophy groups. In fact, tomorrow afternoon, I'll be going to a group where we discuss the meaning of life and how meaningless our lives are. It's an optimistic group.
Or realistic.
Huh?
Or realistic.
Realistic. Yes, yeah.
David, I'm curious now. You've got balloons saying happy behind you. Off screen, are there don't be in front of that?
Oh, yeah. No, I should admit I'm kind of lazy. It's from a birthday a couple of years ago, and I took the birthday part fell off, but the happy stayed on the mirror, so I just left it. So there's no real significance other than it indicates my turpitude.
Does that mean you're going to get banned from your philosophy group then?
No, because we're all a bunch of lazy.
No, because you're being happy, not because you're being lazy.
I like to think of myself as a lazy philosopher. Keep it simple. It's just a material world, only physical. That's it. Simple and lazy.
Well, you know what's funny you say about that? Bill Gates used to say he always liked to hire lazy engineers, because if you hire a lazy engineer, they're going to figure out how to automate things so well that they don't have to do as much work. So he thought the lazy engineers were the good ones. Something like that. But yeah.
You personally wouldn't hire any lazy programmers, but
well, while I wouldn't hire a lazy one, I would hire one who would automate themselves out of the low value work, and that's what my engineers do. They use ChatGPT for the low value work, and then they work on the hard stuff.
Yeah,
Make 'em-
GPT, I use it on the weekend. Not that I use it much, but it was pretty good. Pretty good.
It's pretty impressive, and I'm actually going to be creating a Freethinker Institute ChatGPT, so stay tuned for that. I'll share in the meeting links once it's done and ready.
Yeah, I mean, I'm confident AI will have general intelligence at human level shortly.
Make your engineers work the help desk, and that'll motivate them.
Okay. All right.
May I share my thoughts regarding AI generally?
Sure.
So one of the things or the cons for like AI, it is a tool for dumbing ourselves. In a way, when we try to like rely on something to give us the information or like think instead of ourselves, our critical thinking wouldn't be like developed in the same way. Like when we used to like calculate everything by hand and work our minds, but after calculators, everything was done by calculator. So we don't have like to work our minds. It is not expanding. It is not visualizing. It is not trying to add new values. So we're just like limiting ourselves when we are relying too much on the AI, not using it as a tool to like improve certain aspects or things that we can't really do by ourselves.
Yeah, so that, we had a conversation about AI. I'm not going to respond to that just because tonight's topic is different, but if we have time afterwards, which I think we will, we can go into talking about AI if we have some time left over, and I'm very open to that. I kind of have a different opinion than that, but I don't want to go into the whys right now because we're about at 7, which is when we kick off. So someone else had their hand up. I don't know if you still wanted to speak.
I was also going to respond, but you want to get things going, so that's
yeah,
fine.
If you don't mind, Steve. We'll probably
the short version is I was a high school teacher, and the calculators let you get to graphing calculators, which like got you to be able to think of more interesting things than just adding and subtracting.
That's
but anyway,
kind of where
I'll drop it there.
Yeah. So that said, we're going to go ahead and get started. I do want to share a link for people that want to learn more about the FTI. Let me actually do kind of the introduction. So you guys have introduced yourselves, so let me introduce myself for people who don't know me already. My name's Garrett Lang. I was a software developer, then turned software inventor. I'm now an entrepreneur. My hobby is writing and discussing practical philosophy. And I often present the things that I write about at these events. And I'm the acting executive director of the Freethinker Institute, which is the organization that brings you tonight's event. We advertise to almost 20 meetups, I think. But the Freethinker Institute is the one that sponsors the events. And so I will share a little bit about the FTI, is what we're called for short. We're not for profit looking to support and empower members. We want to help people be the best versions of ourselves, to seek truth and to be fair, do transformational personal and professional development. We have free events on Tuesday evening like this one that cover a wide range of topics not typically covered in academia or industry. And then we have weekly members only events for people who want to apply to be members of the FTI, where we apply practical wisdom into our daily lives. And those are a lot of fun, but smaller groups where we get to know each other in groups of 10 or fewer. We have only one rule in the FTI, and that is to remain polite. I recommend the more you disagree with someone, the more important it is to listen to them, to understand where they're coming from, and maybe ask thoughtful questions. When we get to the Q&A portion, we'll talk about how we can ask clarifying questions of each other when people have their turn to speak. It's always fair game to ask people clarifying questions. And so with that said, we call listening to other people that we disagree with listening to understand, where we're trying to listen to them to understand where they're coming from. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and go into slideshow mode, and then present. All right, so I will ask people to save questions until the end of the presentation. Based on popular feedback, people want to see the presentation given, and then so that they can hear the argument first that's presented, and then we'll go into Q&A, and people can ask clarifying questions. Just grab a pen and paper or your favorite typing device and write down your questions, and then we'll get to them all at the end. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time for all the questions people have. I don't think I have like a very long presentation, and I don't remember. So first I'm going to do a quick overview of what thought experiments are, although we kind of covered that a little bit in the social, but I'll just clarify quickly for people that joined partway through the social. And then I'll cover the thought experiment to end unrealistic thought experiments. So, and then I'll generalize that takeaway, and then talk about how thought experiments can be useful. David gave the Cliff's Notes version of that, but we'll talk about it with a logical proof defending it. So first, thought experiments are really just hypothetical scenarios where you're given a scenario between where you have multiple choices, and you need to choose what you will do in that scenario. So it's nothing complicated. It's the individual thought experiments can be complicated, and you'll see that the one that I'm going to give is a little complicated, but it's not that complicated, to be honest. But I tried to make the simplest thought experiment that was clearly demonstrative of what I think is wrong with a lot of thought experiments. And I will, in the end, give a couple of examples of famous thought experiments that fall prey to the type of thinking that I'm criticizing tonight. So let's talk about a thought experiment that is so unrealistic that it actually creates the wrong insights. Suppose one day you're walking down the street, you encounter a magical unicorn. To prove that it's magical, it performs a few miracles, convincing you that it's very powerful. Now, your entire gut feeling, it tells you that your entire gut feeling and the empathy that you normally feel in life is totally wrong. What you need to do in this world is find, capture, and torture the people that you think are the most ethical in life. And if you don't do this, you will suffer eternal punishment in hell. That's a pretty rough diagnosis there. So logically, the unicorn has shown that it's magical and powerful. And so the threat of eternal hell is much worse than the emotional pain you're going to feel, although it's going to hurt to torture these people. But it's a finite amount of time that you're going to have to torture people, whereas you're going to end, and probably I should add that you'll experience eternal bliss after you die, because that just makes it a full circle, eternal heaven versus eternal hell for following his advice or not following it. And so now I'm going to ask you, what would you do if you encountered such a unicorn? It proved itself powerful and magical. Who would torture all of the people that they thought were the most ethical in life, and who would ignore the unicorn? And so I'm going to let people write in the chat.
Sorry.
Will, I like Will's answer. That's the best answer I've heard. DLJ, you have your hand up, but do you have a clarifying question about the thought experiment?
No, sorry, I was just going to answer it. I would say I would stop taking the drugs if I'm seeing magical unicorns.
Well, you hadn't taken any drugs, so this is
well,
a legit...
maybe the drug I'm taking, it makes me think I'm not taking drugs.
Well, in the case of the thought experiment, you hadn't taken any drugs, so not judging your personal life. I'm just saying in the thought experiment. So so what would people do? So one person, David, would follow the unicorn. I had a feeling, David, but eat unicorn sushi. I like these answers. Yeah, like F you, unicorn. Like so we got a bunch of answers there. Thank you guys for sharing. So I'm going to explain why the people who decided to, turn the unicorn into unicorn soup were probably the most right. Although I probably wouldn't actually try to turn it into unicorn soup, because if it had performed a couple of miracles, I wouldn't really want to mess with it. I would just go on my merry way and try to get away from it. But here's the answer is, like, while the unicorn has proven itself to be powerful, we really have to trust our own judgment of what's right and wrong, which a lot of people in the chat said, even though logically, you could make a pretty good argument that you should follow the unicorn's advice. The key reason that you probably shouldn't follow the unicorn's advice is because the premise that the unicorn is being honest and that you're really going to suffer the punishment that he's saying you're going to suffer, even though it's powerful, it's actually the weakest link is the unicorn saying that you should go against your own feeling and your own, feeling of what's right and wrong. And so, what I would argue is that if my essay on free will is right, we have a metaphysical spirit, and if science and my a priori argument are right, that we reincarnate, it's far more likely that the unicorn is lying. And even if that weren't all true, which probably a lot of people who answered not to listen to the unicorn don't necessarily believe all that, but they will trust their own inherent sense of right and wrong. And Mina, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask to hold the questions until the end, and we'll definitely have time for questions. And so I'm going to create a generalized takeaway of the thought experiment. So assertion A is, if you don't torture ethical people or any, you will go to eternal hell. And if you take that as a completely unrealistic assumption, then you will logically need to torture people in order to, which is, statement B, which is, like the wrong thing to do based on what we just analyzed with the thought experiment. And basically what, I forgot to describe exactly what a proof by contradiction is. It's when, if you assume a certain thing to be true, and then you come to a logical conclusion that contradicts what you know to be true, then you can actually prove that your assumption is false. And so that's a proof by contradiction, which is essentially what thought experiments that are so unrealistic that you can, if you come up with an assumption that leads you to a logical conclusion that is absolutely false, which torturing everyone you think is the most ethical is pretty clearly false, as people honed in on and trusted their instincts on, for the most part. And so inherently what we can prove is, because we know that B is false, is that we should not torture. We know that we should not torture ethical people. We know that actually assertion A is false, which is the unicorn's assertion that if we don't torture people, we'll go to eternal hell. And so actually the generalization is anything that is assumed to be true in a thought experiment that leads to a logical contradiction can then be shown to be more likely false if there's a chain of logic from one to the other. And so that's the general logic that shows that unrealistic assumptions actually not only don't give good results, they give the wrong results. They actually will tell you to do the wrong thing, which is actually a lack of wisdom. An unrealistic premise in a thought experiment will lead you to the wrong conclusions. And, for those that weren't at the series on critical thinking that I did, the last session that I did was on wisdom. And what I talked about is the opposite of wisdom is folly. And so, folly is where you make the wrong, decisions ethically or morally. And unrealistic thought experiments actually lead to folly rather than to wisdom. So not only should they not be considered philosophy, they're considered like the anti-philosophy, in my opinion. So that said, this doesn't mean that thought experiments aren't useful. If the premises of a thought experiment are super unrealistic, then it's not useful. But if you keep the premises of a thought experiment to be very likely realistic and true, then they can do exactly what David and other folks were talking about earlier, which is create clarifications that help better discern what is meant by X and Y. And you'll have to come up with definitions for the words and the terms that the thought experiment is about. And so you get very precise with your language about what is meant, and that creates a more meaningful insight. So let's look at a useful thought experiment. Suppose that you agree that causing significant unnecessary harm against all human beings is something that we should do our best to prevent, which I tried to argue in my week on wisdom, that's one thing that we should all agree, that we should prevent significant unnecessary harm against all human beings. And then suppose that a company with a cheaper product that uses slave labor is offering that product, at a lower price than an ethical company, which has a more expensive product but does not use slave labor. And you can afford the 20% extra price if you decide to not have any sweets this week. What should you do? Do you buy from the ethical company and not have any sweets, or do you provide from the unethical company and you get sweets this week? And so put in the chat which one you would do. I see a lot of people saying the ethical company, very consistent. And I love to hear that, because that is what I think is the single thing that every one of us on this call can do to make the world a better place, is to buy from ethical companies. This is not a made-up experiment. I don't know if you know this. I have a friend that works at one of these companies, but almost all of the mainstream chocolate companies still have slave labor in their supply chains, which I just learned about like this year. And they are trying to get rid of it, but these supply chains are very complicated, and they haven't been able to fully eliminate them or show that they were able to eliminate them. There are some ethical companies where the chocolate is a little more expensive, but you're not contributing to slave labor in the supply chain. So that's an example where a little bit of research can help you buy from the more ethical company. If you don't research, you're almost definitely buying chocolate from one of the unethical companies. But that's where there's a lack of transparency, which someday, if I make enough money, I will try to create more transparency about who are the ethical companies. There was a good iPhone app that used to do it, but unfortunately it's been removed from the iPhone store. But hopefully I can buy their assets and try to get them back, because I have a feeling it was some guy that was running out of his basement and just ran out of money, and did a lot of research, quite frankly, because it was very well informed. But that said, I'm going to go to the next slide. So you all chose the right answer. When we can afford it, we should spend more money to buy from ethical companies. This really does make the world a better place. I'm going to give a couple of examples of some famous thought experiments. One is, I believe it's called the experience machine. And what it is it's a machine that's basically a simulation. When you jump into it, I believe you don't know that you're in a simulation, but you can learn, grow, and develop. And the assumption is that nothing in the world in which you jumped into the simulation could possibly go wrong, right? By you being in the simulation. But that seems completely unrealistic to me, because what if everybody jumped into the machine except for one guy? Then that guy can decide what they want to do in that world, and and basically the idea is that if you're in this experience machine, you can learn, you can grow, you can live, you can die, but nothing bad really happens when you die. You don't really die, you just go back into the real world. And interestingly, this, even though it has a very unrealistic premise, it's a very, very famous thought experiment that the author is very famous for. I think it's does anyone remember Nadel? Was it Nadel? So I can Google it. I'm blanking on his name, but and then another one is Nozick. That's it. Another one is an ant is walking on sand. And I'm not making this up, believe it or not. This is really like a very famous essay. An ant is walking on sand and happens to draw a picture in the sand with its trail that looks just like a picture of Winston Churchill's head. Right? What are the chances of that? Like, yeah, bizarrely unlikely to ever happen in the history of the world. And yet the question that it asks is it really a picture of Winston Churchill's head? And my answer is, like, any conclusion you're going to draw is completely useless because it's totally unrealistic that that would ever happen. And so it really, like, doesn't even make sense to think about, in my opinion. But if you were to think about it and come to a conclusion, it's very likely that the conclusion you come to, if you could come to a solid one, is wrong, because the premise is actually the weakest link. And so the premise is actually more likely to draw you, lead you to the wrong conclusion. So that said, I did say it was going to be short, and we're 20 minutes in. And so my question is, did this make sense? Was it helpful? And all questions, hands can go up. For the Q&A, I asked people to limit to one question or comment at a time, and limit to less than 2 or 3 minutes per question or comment. After someone speaks up, if you want to ask a clarifying question of what they said, I'm going to respond to people so people feel heard and there's conversation. And I might ask them clarifying questions too. But if you guys want to ask questions of the person who spoke, feel free to just speak up, because we have more than one screen. I'm not going to be able to see if someone wants to speak up. So just speak up and ask a question, but leave it to like 20, no more than 30 seconds, asking a clarifying question to whoever just spoke. And that said, I'm gonna go ahead and let Carrie start off with questions.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Garrett. This isn't as much a question as much as it's just, I guess, an opinion on what I've always used or seen hypotheticals used for. And I mean, back when I was studying philosophy, we used to make jokes about ethics lab, right? And why it's probably good that we don't have them. But that the hypothetical is used mainly to illustrate, the extension of concepts. So if somebody proposes some kind of, utilitarian philosophy or something like that, you can say, hey, but if you say this and you're consistent with it, if we move, conceptually, to the end of that road, this is what it would mean. And do you accept that outcome? So it's a way to conceptually identify kind of the bookends, right? This philosophy yields this result, that philosophy yields this other result. Now, I mean, that does have its own set of issues, but what do you have a response to that as kind of a support for the actual project we're trying to accomplish?
Let me make sure I understand. So I think what you're saying is that, like I was reiterating what I think David said, which is that, when you're using a thought experiment to create clarity about a specific situation with realistic premises, then you can add a lot of value in sort of showing people the logical implications of what they have said and walking them down the path of, well, if you, and I actually did this, we had a conversation on Citizens United, and I said, well, clearly free speech isn't taxable, right? Like, it'd be ridiculous to say free speech is taxable. And so if free speech isn't taxable and giving money is free speech, my employer is allowed to give me money and I don't have to pay any taxes. And boom, I just defunded the US government with the Citizens United argument. So the logical implications are often missing on people. And there's one where if you find me missing tomorrow, you'll know why. No, I'm just but yeah, I do think that the clarification and helping people understand the implications is a really good application of thought experiments, with realistic premises and, realistic scenarios. Now, if you start to go off into unrealistic scenarios, then I think all bets are off and you're going to come to the wrong conclusions. and you know, then you can sort of, you know, and that gets into the straw man argument, and none of us like to be straw manned. And so if someone, you know, starts to make, you know, illogical jumps or leaps and say you're saying you know, what's implied by what you just said is X and it's not, then I'd say we're in unsafe territory. Does that make sense, Carrie?
Yes.
Cool. David.
I think personally that almost everyone will be unethical if the cost of being ethical is too high. For instance, eternity in hell. That's a high cost. Sure, people right away said, oh, yeah, I'd do the right thing. I wouldn't kill these innocent people. Sure, but if they actually had a taste of hell and they'd had it for 10, 20, 30 minutes, they might come back and say, well, maybe, you know, these people, it's not going to cost me anything. And sure, it's an unethical thing to do, but eternity in hell is a mighty bad situation. Let me see, that's the trouble. Your unicorn situation had too many unrealistic things, like the unicorn, it's magic. Is it ethical? Is it God? Who knows what? I got a much simpler and also very ethical dilemma. We all know the trolley problem. I think we all know the trolley problem.
Yes.
So you
but
got
go ahead and say it, because maybe not everybody knows it, David. So
okay, you got a trolley heading down San Francisco Hill, and it's out of control. The brakes don't work. There's 20 people on it. They're all innocent. They're just on this trolley. It starts speeding down the hill. You happen to be luckily at an intersection where you can throw a lever to have the trolley turn onto a side street and stop gradually, and everyone's saved. Unfortunately, there's an innocent person standing on that side street right in the middle of the tracks. So you've got to decide, well, you know, I'm going to actually kill this. In effect, I'm going to be the reason this single guy gets killed. But on the other hand, I'm saving 20. So that's a simple one. Well, it could be simple for a lot of people. Some people would say, no. But let me say this. If that single person standing on the track on the side street who will be killed by the trolley is your mother, now what do you do? And I would argue, even though it's ethically still, you know, in the sense that you're going to save 20 people, virtually no one would save the 20 people. I would argue almost everyone would say, sorry, it's my mother, and let that 20 go. So that's a much more, I think, interesting ethical. It's the cost of being ethical is much higher, and it's also clear, and I think it's a more realistic thought experiment than, say, unicorns and magic and all the rest of it. Because the trolley, it's a famous experiment.
I know it's famous, but I would argue that it's not super realistic, and it's a little bit of laziness in that you could come up with a much more realistic scenario that is an actual trade-off between one life and 20. That's much more realistic than being in control of a trolley cart, right? Like, when am I I mean, I've been in trolley territory. I never was near a lever that could switch the trolley from one track to another. I don't know that any of us ever have been. So I would argue that while it's very famous, it's a good example of an unrealistic thought experiment, but it's one that you could easily convert to a realistic one so that, you know, it is still useful because the part of it that's unrealistic can be made realistic. So yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, during World War II, a lot of people faced ethical dilemmas that were very realistic. In fact, they were actual, you know,
yeah.
You know, do you give up the Jewish neighbor who you know is hiding in their house in order that you know, this nasty guy is not going to kill your family? You know that. But I think the trolley, I think, is clear enough, and it's also easy to understand, and it doesn't have that kind of Nazi killing your family overtones, which is kind of a, you know, mucky.
Right. Yeah, and again, like, not you know, not meaning to you know, criticize on, like, for no good reason, but like, while I think that it's unrealistic, I think it can be converted to realistic, and it still adds a lot of value and is a useful dilemma. I know it's a classic problem. I just think that it's not a realistic construction, but the trade-off of one life versus 20 is a very realistic trade-off that happens all the time. that's collateral damage, like
I
World
don't.
War II, like entering World War II was a trade-off of lives too. And so anyway, let's get
Well,
to.
I don't
Just
think
one-
it's meant
sorry,
to
go
be
ahead.
real. I don't think it's meant to be
sec.
real.
Yeah, I was just going to say the cost of eternity in hell. I don't think people really thought about that as
I
much
think
as they should.
at least the way that when I answered this myself, David, I just didn't trust the unicorn was right about the eternity in hell.
Wait a minute, you have to say the unicorn, you can't, that's a weasel. You have to say the unicorn is accurate. What it says will go.
But you
can't
don't
have a
know that,
blind-
right? You never know what's accurate. Like you have to make your
you're
assessment.
doing the thought
You know
experiment.
that the unicorn is magic. You
Yes.
know that the unicorn has shown that it's magic.
And
but you
it can
don't know that
condemn you.
everything it says is definitely true.
Well, you're implying by being magic, it can condemn you to hell. You're not assuming its magic is limited. I'd say part of, I mean, why did you even say it's magic? Why do you know it's magic?
Because
it can
David, this
condemn
is
you.
where I believe in a higher power that's probably more powerful than the unicorn. So that's why
You didn't mention you can't. That's a weasel. You can't. You got to have a thought experiment self-contained. You can't say, well, actually, there's something else that I didn't bring into it. Come on, that's not a thought experiment.
Again, it is you have to. My point is that if the assumptions of a thought experiment are unsound, that you come to the wrong conclusions, and I think that's valid whether or not and I agree with you, David. I think people are underestimating the possibility of what it would be like to be in hell, but I still think that you have to always know that the future is uncertain, but for you the future is certain. And so you probably can't conceive of what it would be like for the future to be uncertain. And so in this case, the place that I think we differ is whether or not the future is certain. You saw it as certain and I saw it as uncertain. So but Steve, you were speaking up. Did you have a clarifying question you wanted to ask?
I was just going to say that you're talking about the trolley problem not being realistic. I don't think it's meant to be realistic. It's meant to pose an ethical dilemma.
Right, and
it succeeds in that.
It does, and that's where I would say it only succeeds at that because you could easily convert the trolley problem to a realistic ethical problem, because it is a realistic ethical problem, but the trolley problem itself in its formulation is not realistic. And that's where I'm kind of, I'm kind of saying, like, while I'm saying unrealistic problems can come to the wrong conclusions, unrealistic problems that can be translated to realistic problems actually can be very insightful, like the trolley problem.
I understand your point. I would say that it's attempting to illustrate the problem while keeping it simple. You might be able to come up with one that is both simple and realistic. I haven't tried, but this one is straightforward in the question it's actually trying to propose. I'll leave it there. I know we have several other people waiting to speak.
Yeah, do you mean the trolley problem is simple and realistic?
It is simple. It's not meant to be realistic. You're posing a question in a simple way.
Right.
Perhaps one could make a realistic and also simple scenario. I haven't tried doing that, except that the trolley problem is fine for what it is.
Yeah, and all I would say, Steve, is I would challenge philosophers to use a simple and realistic one rather than a simple unrealistic one. But yeah, but I agree with you. So Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the question would be, is the setup, does it somehow kind of kneecap the ethical dilemma that you're exploring? Because I think some people, when they come up with these, they just try to come up with something that's clever and funny. And, they're not trying, they want you to focus on the dilemma, and then they just have some fun with the setup. But, one of the examples here, I think, or what I think a lot of these thought experiments are trying to do is not direct us toward an answer more, but to illustrate a personal exploration, like the ant and the Churchill. I mean, that's the classic, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? Right. And it's designed to help you define terms. What is a sound? Does it have to be in somebody's mind? Does the creator have to have it in their mind? Like, clearly the ant's not thinking of Churchill, but once you apprehend it as Churchill's face, that clearly exists, at least in your mind. And it's just meant to illustrate to students or whoever the person is that these are kind of the dilemmas that we're faced with.
Yeah. And yeah, all I would say is that, like, you would have to come up with, again, like, maybe there's a formulation of like a 4-year-old child, draws a painting and it looks like a picture of Winston Churchill's head, and the child has never seen Winston Churchill. Is that a picture of Winston Churchill? That's more realistic than, saying an ant is going to draw a picture. Like, I'm just trying to fix it with something that's a little less far-fetched. And I think that it's more easy to digest something that has realistic roots because we can connect with reality more easily through more realistic examples. And so I think they're more insightful than the unrealistic ones.
So do you think that part of the issue is certain members of the audience may get hung up on the details of the setup? Maybe they're being a little more literal and other people are jumping right to the abstract right away.
I think you can literally like prove the wrong thing because the premises are so unrealistic. And that's what I tried to show with my example, is that because my premise was so unrealistic that, that torturing the most ethical people would get you out of hell instead of get you into hell. Like, that's so unrealistic that you're going to come to the wrong conclusion. You're going to come to the conclusion that you should torture the innocent people logically, but like, none of us would want to do that. Like, none of us felt right doing that except David. But but David is a determinist, so he felt like it was a foregone conclusion that the unicorn was right because it was so powerful. And at that time in his life, it was the most powerful thing he'd ever experienced. And he pretty much assumed that his fate was in the unicorn's hands, come hell or high water, if I'm not wrong. And I'm trying to empathize here, and David's nodding, so I think I'm doing a good job of it. And I can see why David would come to that conclusion. To be honest, like, my logical conclusion was the same thing, like, torture the people, but I wouldn't do it. But the reason I wouldn't do it is because I wouldn't trust the unicorn, because I would entrust my inherent sense of what's right and wrong. And the fact that I'm trying to be truthful to myself about what's right and wrong, and to not be afraid of, something, that's seemingly powerful, that's threatening me, basically, and threatening me to go against my own instincts. So
if that question were on the exam, I would hope everybody, if they had that question, would clarify what the status of the unicorn is, because that's really the key right there, right? Because I'm thinking of, Descartes' deceiver, right? Is the unicorn being ethical in giving you those instructions? And David is like, no, this thing is God.
Right.
Right. And they're going to yield totally divergent results.
And this is why, like, as a professor, I wouldn't answer that question. I would say you have to answer it yourself, because you as a student need to decide, like, if I see this unicorn and I know that the future, I think that there's free will. And so I think the future is uncertain, and it's determined by the free will of the people, the people and powers that be. And so I would say there's a chance that this unicorn's full of it, right? And so I'm not going to trust them. I'm going to trust my own instincts first, even though it's powerful. And so it does become a philosophical quandary that is a little muddled in other beliefs like free will and determinism and non-determinism. So
maybe it's an allegory for the story of Abraham.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is, to be honest, now that you mention it. In some respects, like, I never really understood, if I'm not remembering wrong, that's where he had to sacrifice his son, right? Yeah. And I never understood, like, God, I don't think God would ever ask me to sacrifice my kids or to try to kill them, but that's just my own take, like, and my own perception of God. I don't want to worship a God that would tell me to kill my kids. So I think God is much better than that. Will, go ahead.
Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, I thought the whole point of the unicorn analogy was that trusting your perception as opposed to the just logic, ethical question with the trolley car. So I thought the nuance there that you created was the fact that you weren't sure if this thing was delusional or not, or if you were experiencing a delusion or not, but it had convinced you to some degree. But so there lay your conundrum, that could you trust your senses against overwhelming evidence? So I thought it was quite different to just the normal ethical dilemma as per the trolley car type analogies. But I was thinking also, just with the trolley car thing, I don't want to digress onto ethics, but this could make perhaps for another topic sometime. We are living the trolley car experiment every moment of the day, in that we could all sell everything we own and save potentially hundreds or thousands of children's lives in third world countries, eight or 10,000 of which die every day from malnutrition. So we could also sell all the clothes. I've heard somewhere, we sold if everyone in the Western world sold every piece of apparel that they haven't worn for the last 2 years, we'd create like $100 billion worth of cash that we could give to charity, but we don't, because the trolley car scenario there is it's just too hard. So I think we're all doing it every day, and we all like to think we're kind of nice people, but again, you know, would you have a nice roast pork pig on your dinner platter this Christmas? Would you love the crispy crackling? Or would you rather give some consideration to the pig that's probably been suffocated to death, because that's how they kill pigs? No, give us the pig. So we're living the trolley car experiment every day, and we're not as ethical as we think we are. Peter Singer, the philosopher, talks about that a lot, actually.
Yeah, had a feeling you were referring to Singer's essay there.
Yeah.
It was a good essay.
I
do actually deal with like why our instincts are a little different from what Singer is saying. Like, I think there is a slight flaw in his argument, which if we get through all the questions we can talk about. But I don't want to digress on ethics, like you said, unless people want to, and if people do, then I'll go there. The concept that I presented on the week of critical thinking on wisdom kind of overcame that that challenge. So that said, Richard.
Jared, I've been standing here with my hand up for 7 or 8 speakers.
So what might have happened,
system work or not?
You know, what might have happened is, if you were speaking, if someone asks a clarifying question to someone who just spoke, they're allowed to jump ahead of the hands. The hands are for introducing new ideas and new topics. So if you had your hand up.
I'd like to clarify a number of your issues.
Sure.
One is, you don't have to make a thought experiment to answer a lot of the issues you have raised. The men who planned the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced that experiment and said, well, I will incinerate 120,000 people who live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Incidentally, Hiroshima was the world's largest defense railroad marshaling yard, so it was vital to the Japanese effort. On the other hand, if I don't, when we invade, and we will, we'll be killing 2 to 5 million Japanese men, women, and children. But they made that decision. And now, because they made that decision, a lot of French philosophers are poo-pooing them. The other decision is the issue of the unicorn. Take the name unicorn away. Put the word God in. Pretend your name is the men running the Inquisition in the 16th century. God tells you to burn Giordano Bruno, and you burn him. And that way you have done good in the eyes of God, but yet you've done something really bad. And thousands of people were burned during the Inquisition, dozens during the witch burnings in Salem, because God said they should. So history is a good predictor and method for analyzing something like that.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. All I would say though is that in the Inquisition, and I use this example when I talk about the 5 intentions, because one of the intentions, number 3, is that we should trust our own critical thinking skills about what's fact and fiction and wisdom from folly, first and foremost. And then when I talk about increasing happiness and decreasing harm, I talk about how preventing significant unnecessary harm should be, for all human beings, should be the first priority. So as long as if everybody were following the 5 intentions in medieval Europe, which they didn't exist back then, but then if the followers of the church leaders had said, look, this doesn't make sense to us, like, you haven't convinced me that, burning these people is actually going to save their souls. That doesn't sound like a good idea. And I'll be honest, I think that if you had taken an anonymous survey of churchgoers at that time, do they think that burning these people is the right thing to do, before they were biased by, basically strong-armed religious leaders? I don't think any of them would have thought it was right. And I bet a lot of them probably felt like it was wrong, but they were following their religious leaders blindly. And that's why I think blind followership has enabled most of the evil that's happened in the world. I don't think that the average person really thinks that, these horribly unethical things that we've seen throughout history were really okay. They just follow blindly, or they're following momentum of leaders who are justifying it. Does that make sense, Richard? You're on mute.
To an extent, that makes sense. I do, however, dispute your premise that most of the people in 1600 did not agree with the motives of the burners. In England in 1812, they stopped hanging pickpockets because the crowds that were eager to watch people hanging a pickpocket were susceptible to pickpockets.
We're susceptible to what?
Pickpockets.
Pickpockets, got it.
In addition, during World War II, there was a famous air mission to rescue members of the Danish underground who were being held on the first floor of a Gestapo building. And it was a very heroic act of either an American or a British flyer who came and pushed his bomb right into the window of the second floor, killing the German guards so they could escape. Unfortunately, his wing tipped some of the wreckage, and his airplane spiraled into an orphanage and killed 200 children in the fire. And yet it's celebrated as a victory.
I think this is where, a common critique of utilitarianism is that utilitarianism is a consequentialist philosophy, whereas like what I teach is kind of a riff on utilitarianism, which is a little bit more akin to virtue ethics with a utilitarian bent and a couple of other things. And that's where I think, the pilot couldn't have possibly known that, that was going to happen. And I'm guessing the pilot died too. And so, I don't know that scenario really well. All I'm saying is that if the intent was, positive, then I can see people saying the intent was positive and that was, something that was, done at the loss of their own life for a greater good. And, I don't know if you can tell me if I'm misreading that.
Many of those questions are, I contend that humans are fundamentally an us versus them species. And whether you decide the pilot was a hero or a villain depends on which of those groups of people you consider the us and which of those people you consider the them.
Yeah, we're all otherists.
I try to not be, but I guess we each, I think being aware that we have a natural proclivity for us versus them is the first step to trying to be less of such a person, such a type of person. And I would argue it would be wise for us all to be conscious of the fact that human beings have a natural tendency of creating an us versus them mentality. And I would argue we should all consider ourselves human, just like all the other humans. And maybe even more than that, we're all sentient beings, just like all the other sentient beings. And therefore, we're really connected to all other sentient beings, not just humans. But that's probably a topic for another night. So that said, Carrie, why don't you go? Go ahead.
When the asentient robot beings come to attack the Earth, we will unite.
Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll see. So I think Richard provided a really interesting illustration of a point I wanted to make, that one of the advantages of the thought experiment with the goofy setup and all that, as long as it actually illustrates what you want it to illustrate, is one of the things that it does is it sanitizes the situation to eliminate a bunch of the cultural bias and baggage that goes along with it, right? If I'm trying to illustrate an ethical dilemma and I've got Nazis on one side, I'm kind of like, putting a thumb on the scale, because there's this right? I mean, I could set up a thought experiment where, the Nazis end up doing something good, right? But that's culturally, Nazi equals bad no matter what, right? But when you're talking about magical unicorns and stuff like that, people have no frame of reference to throw all this extra stuff on it that's going to cloud the issue. As soon as we start talking about unforeseen consequences in World War II, oh geez, it's going to be a real mess, trying to tease out any kind of proper, just even an educational example.
Very good point.
Yeah, definitely a good point. Thanks, Carrie, for making that. Mina, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I would say one of the things that I found really kind of hard to do this kind of experimental thoughts is the variables. There are a lot of variables we're not considering. Someone mentioned, I think it was David, or when he mentioned that we are the others in every scenarios, that other than ours scenario. So if what you're saying about experimental thoughts, it is about revealing some sort of facts or truth about situations, I would say the following. It need to be proven questions in order to activate critical thinking for that kind of person, because you need to consider the following things. The first thing, which is, if we're talking about unicorns, but not in the image you're mentioning, but the existence of them. Because you mentioned unicorns, this kind of magical unicorns, or ordering people to torture and kill others and stuff like that. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the existence of magical unicorns, the idea itself. So does they exist or not? Let's say that the magical unicorns are referred to as God or something, or higher power or whatever. So does they exist or not? So if they do exist, that's the whole thing. We could be aware of, we could not be aware of. What we should be discussing is the following: blind followers. Because blind followers, that means they are canceling their own capacity to think critically for themselves. And therefore, your experimental thoughts would be helpful to activate or work on this kind of thing that they have missed, or trying to make them work with their own minds. like probing questions and trying to like understanding, not challenging, because challenging will lead to defensive positions. Like, they will be like defensive and act in that kind of way, which is the opposite intended outcome of what do you mean. It is not about like arguing that you are correct and they are like idiots. You're not trying to prove them idiots or dumb or whatever. You're just trying to probe questions in order for you to like active this kind of critical thinking and ability that they have. The other thing is like controlling. Let's say that I'm presenting the magical unicorns or God or whatever, and I'm trying to like control people through this kind of thing. That will be like really effective tool. It has been for like since the beginning of like mankind. Really effective tool to control people, the mass. Therefore, you need to consider that valuable as well. So interpretation is something else as well. So what if God exists or magical unicorn exists, but and there's some sort of like text or whatever, but we interpret this kind of text according to our limited vocabulary or understanding or even desires, so it can match whatever we need or feel. Therefore, there's like interpretations. There are like a tool of control, intentionally tool of control, and there are like blind followers, and maybe there are like other factors I'm like I'm not aware of yet. So there's difference between first thing we need to understand is the possibility, not the probability. The possibility of something exists and how like people act towards that. So sometimes like there's like a myth or a real story or truth that started like decades ago. And later in life, people start to change this kind of story according to their own desires or needs, or someone like asks something and tell it to someone else, like the game of like telephone booth. So in that kind of way, we need to account for variables.
Yeah, just wanted
I
to
think
finish your
that-
thought because you're going a little long, and you covered more than one thought. So let's try to keep each hand. You'll there's not a lot of hands up, so you'll have plenty of time to cover other thoughts with another hand raised. But I do agree with a lot of what you said, Mina. What I was able to take notes on and can reply to is challenging people makes them defensive. That's why we try to listen to understand. I agree with you completely. And I wish more people would listen to other people that they disagree with more often. I think we learn so much more from listening than we do from telling people why we think they're wrong. We don't learn from that. Like maybe they'll learn from it, but usually not. They'll just get defensive and angry at us. So, but unfortunately, that's how most political conversations go these days. We're going to have to all practice our listening to understand on the Israel-Palestine event because we are going to do that. I'm going to add that later on in December probably. Although I don't know if I want to do that right around Christmas, but maybe I will. It's a good time to remember love and compassion that Christ taught us all to have. And we still haven't figured out 2,000 years after his death, untimely death. The other thing about whether or not magical unicorns exist, I know a lot of people who have done magic mushrooms, and they will say they've seen a lot of things that most of us would say are not real. And you know what I find really fascinating about this? For me, I just go, well, there's some experience going on there. I think they could be tapping into a metaphysical world. Who knows? Like, I'm a pretty open-minded guy, but some of them will go so far as to say that our reality that we see day in and day out is the wrong reality. It's not the real reality. The real reality is what they saw in the magic mushrooms. And they would say that's more real than what we see day to day, all the time. And I asked someone, so why is it that, because I was listening to understand, I was like, so why is it you think that reality that you saw when you did mushrooms is more real than the reality we see every day? They didn't answer that. I think they got a little upset that I asked. But like, I was just curious, like I do think drugs could do all kinds of interesting things and may tap into unseen worlds. Like, I believe all that, but that's for me not yet a reason to not believe that this reality is real. And in fact, I have a logical argument that even if we live in a simulation, it's null and like it's irrelevant, because the winning strategy, if we live in a simulation, is to treat it as if it's real. And so the whole simulation hypothesis, while intellectually interesting, is meaningless in my opinion. So that said, I want to let Carrie go.
All right, this is getting good. So so one of the things I think the last few speakers, they kind of brought up an interesting point. And what I'm wondering is if maybe the issue here in the thought experiment, you know, these things, this maybe is a little more art than science, in that they're dynamic, and maybe they're really their utility is more dependent on the ability and clarity of the teacher. Because I mean, at first I was thinking, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to eliminate variables, or are we trying to illustrate variables? Right. And the thing is that there's not one answer. You can do both with a good hypothetical. And I'm thinking, for an example, your dilemma about ethical chocolate, right? Well, one of the unexamined portions of that was if you can afford it. Right. There's a whole avenue for discussion there, because the people who can easily afford it, it's a simple decision for them, right? And then, you know, I mean, just as an example for discussion,
I sort of did address that in that I said you have to give up sweets in order to buy the more ethical product. So there was like a trade-off, you know, that was possible. Now, when you say can't afford it, some of the people who say they can't afford, for example, organic food, will buy $100 pair of shoes. And it's like, well, you can afford the $100 pair of shoes when there's a $20 pair of shoes, but you can't afford the organic food. And, you know, it's a matter of priorities, like which one is important to them. And, you know, organic food is, you know, probably a very superfluous example. There are other things, you know, that you know, make a better example. I just did it off the top of my head, but go ahead.
But yeah, by means of example, though, I mean, I remember when they were tuna was caught in big drift nets, and they were killing thousands and thousands of dolphins, and people got all bent out of shape. There was a campaign for dolphin safe tuna, and now tuna are pretty much all line caught, right? You know, I mean, the ethical, I mean, perhaps, you know, I mean, again, we could read into this and look at the stats. Maybe it ultimately was a bad result. I don't know. But the market certainly took the side of the more expensive product for ethical reasons, which I think supports your perception that there's a market there.
I glibly put this in the chat, but you know, the purpose of the thought experiment is to provide, and this is why I'm not so hung up on it being realistic, it's to clearly pose a question to be answered. But it inevitably, and should, usually, I think, start the conversation. You know, you're going to start talking about, yeah, but what if, but what if, but what if, which is what we've been doing all evening. And so the hypothetical has served its purpose. You know, it has posed a question and allowed us to discuss it and elaborate on it.
Yeah, no, I agree that a good thought experiment starts the conversation, and it seeks to find clarity. Steve, I'm going to be a little bit of a stickler with you, and I apologize for doing it, but I just want to say, you know, try to put your hand up if you're starting a new thought. The speaking up, like out of turn of hands, is more to ask questions of the person that just spoke. Just
I was
clarify
directly
questions.
responding to Carrie is what I was attempting to do.
Okay, sorry, I just was too slow to realize that. Apologies, then my mistake. So David, go ahead.
I think Carrie was bringing up an interesting point. The cost of being ethical. It's easy to be ethical if the cost is very low. It's much harder when the cost is extremely high. I think this is kind of an underlying theme that we got from the magical unicorn and the trolley problem, is the cost of being ethical. I would argue that everyone would be unethical given a high enough cost, unless, unless you're somehow above the million, above the fray, and can somehow not worry about costs at all. But I'd say humans in general will be ethical when the cost is not too high, and unethical when the cost is too high. That's kind of an underlying theme, I think, from your unicorn example. I don't know whether
Yeah,
I don't know whether this is throwing a monkey wrench in the discussion or what, but
no, it's evolving it in a great direction. And I actually think we should do another one on or maybe we can just hit it tonight. If well, I want to let people get to their hands, but I'm going to make a quick comment on the Milgram experiment is like an example where the cost was high, right? And you know, the way the Milgram experiment was written, you know, was taught to me in school, quite frankly, and seemed shocking. And it's taught for the shock effect of, hey, if you tell an authority, if an authority tells you to shock someone to death, people will press the shock button to shock to death just to follow authority. What they don't tell you is those people in that experiment were paid like $5,000 to $6,000 to join that experiment. That was a ton of money at that time. That's probably like, you know, $70,000 to $100,000 now. And the fact is, they probably thought if they didn't press that button, they were going to lose all that money. And so it's not just following authority that the Milgram experiments talked about. I read the study and no one ever taught me that. It was only that I actually read the details of the study that I learned the truth about it, because I was like, this doesn't make sense to me. Why would people do that? It's just so like against our innate nature. Well, it was, the stakes were so high. They were, you know, these people might have needed this money to survive. And, you know, if they had targeted lower socioeconomic people as the experiment, the study people in that experiment, which would be an interesting follow on for me to do, is like, what was their, how did they choose the people that were in the study? You know, if you took, you know, poor people and offered them $100,000 to shock someone to death, yeah, they might do it. Like, but that's not because they just trust authority blindly. It's because they really, really need the money and they're desperate and they're willing to cause significant harm to do it. That's why the Nazis got so much popularity, is, you know, they basically made people afraid to fight against them. And go ahead.
I just Googled the Milgram experiment and it said they were paid $4.50. I'm not sure where you got the thousands.
That was when I read the study a while ago, but where did you Googled it? I'll look up. I looked up the actual study itself.
Because that would compound the results if they were paid such a high amount of money.
I know, that's why it shocked me.
It would nullify the conclusion of the experiment. I think that would be a major issue, and I don't think it's true.
Well, I'll have to fact check it again. It was like 15 years ago that I looked it up, so I might be wrong. But I'll fact check it.
Some people. Okay, all right.
Put the link. Put the link in the chat, David.
A link? Oh, I don't know how to do that. That's okay. I guess I can try. Okay.
Yeah. Carrie, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, if you want to grab a bunch of people, have a talk on whether ethics is a privilege or a luxury, right? Damn.
Yeah.
It's a you know, I mean, I've always, well, for a while I've argued that, you know, the transition from slavery to finding it unethical had to do with there being economic alternatives. You know, nobody in the old world gave it a second thought. It was just assumed that, you know, we need this, so it's okay. And as soon as there are better alternatives, but then all of a sudden everyone's like, well, maybe this is really a bad idea. And regarding you know, the pressure element, you know, with Milgram and the Nazis, there's an account of, I think it was Goering, I could be wrong, where, you know, somebody was asking him when he's in his cell, you know, in Nuremberg, you know, how did all you people just go along with this stuff? And he said something to the effect of, what you see here are all yes men, because all the no men are 6 feet underground, which, you know,
yeah,
kind of tells its own story.
That's a cost. Yeah.
Anyone have other questions?
Well, I could just fill the void with a question, Garrett.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I was wondering about the picture of the ant, the picture of Churchill's head from the ant. So maybe you could clarify, because I was a bit distracted when you were talking about that. And so I didn't quite get the full image of what you were saying, no pun intended. But I'm thinking that the picture that by random chance has emerged, as in this case, the result of an ant walking around, can you qualify that as a picture in the thought experiment? And I would say then that the definition of whether it's a picture as such or not is relative to how it is utilized. So, for instance, if you were to then get a friend and say, look, there's a picture of Churchill's head that's been, there's an image, because it's just an image that's perceived by the perceiver. But then if you then qualify that and would like to share that, say, for instance, with someone else, and then you would describe it, then it becomes a picture, because when you're conveying the image to someone else, your utilization of the, at this time, image has now made it become, like with observer effect, it is now a picture, and it's about functionality. So the function of it now is it is a picture. It's no longer an image in that thought experiment, I would say. But I might have got the whole thing wrong because I wasn't really listening. And I've only said that to fill a gap. So
yeah, no, I appreciate it.
Rubbish,
the thought experiment was that if an ant was randomly walking on sand and created an image in the sand that looked like a picture of Winston Churchill's head, then is it actually a picture of Winston Churchill's head, or is it just
it's an image? I'd say it's an image until it's
I guess for me that's like a distinction without a difference. I don't see a.
It's fascinating. It's a great one. I love that one.
Yeah, I don't find it super interesting, but like that's okay. That's why different people get different values out of different things.
May I chip in here?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so regarding this kind of thing, we need to as like well said, it is about the perceiver itself, and why it is like really make a difference, because like we as humans usually tend to like fill in the gaps when you are seeing things or hearing things in order to understand them. So filling in the gaps, usually it depends on how much information do we have. So that's how, or at least inputs or whatever, and how like our minds trying to make sense of that kind of new input. And another thing would be the following. I remember like a scene from like a movie, I think, I'm not sure, where someone had some sort of like original idea that it wasn't compared to any kind of thought before ever, and no one can relate it to something else, can compare it to, and therefore when they hear the original idea, their head explodes out of the like overwhelming. So this kind of like philosophy or metaphor or analogy explain that sometimes when we hear certain thoughts or ideas that overwhelm our minds, we feel confused, and usually we tend to like fill into the like really simple things, which is like filling in the gaps or try to associate it with whatever inputs we have to compare it to. Yeah, that's it for me.
Great, thanks, Mina. David, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think communication is where you have a resonance between the sender and the receiver. And in the case of the ant, you don't have any sort of communication because the ant is not on the, the person who's perceiving Winston Churchill's head isn't on the same wavelength as the ant. But if normally an artist creates a painting, the idea of the painting is to induce somebody who's watching the painting to feel what the artist was feeling, or to see the world the way and this applies to writing, art. Ants in the sand, you don't get that resonance but like I think Mina was saying, we're pattern makers. Our brains automatically, you see a random pattern on a beach, whether it's an ant or whatever, and we tend to say, hey, wait a minute, that looks like that's Winston Churchill there, you know. Or I saw recently on YouTube, there was everyone in awe at a cloud up in the sky that looked like Jesus. And, you know, had I not known that they saw Jesus there, I wouldn't have even seen it. But since, you know, it was quite remarkable. Everyone's on the beach going, oh my God, look. And, you know, I think we tend to be seeing patterns where there may be randomness. That's all I have to say about ants and Churchill. I mean, resonance is what communication is all about, and ant is not resonating with humans, so therefore.
So David, you gave me a good way to translate that thought experiment into a more realistic one. Let's suppose an artist, John Doe, creates an abstract piece of art that he wants to make people feel sad, but then Sally Smith sees John's art and goes, gosh, this makes me so happy, right? And she buys his art. You know, what's the deal? Is the art, is it still a piece of art? Like, you know, like
you've undermined my whole argument. It's in the eye of the beholder. It's not a resonance.
Well, that's where I feel like my realistic example actually helped you come to the right conclusion, whereas her unrealistic example, you know, actually brought you to the wrong conclusion because it made you pay attention to the facts that were less relevant to the scenario, whereas the realistic example helps us clarify and hone, like you originally started tonight's conversation, David, where I said you had the Cliff Notes of like what I was going to present is like there's got to be meaningful clarity and clarification, and if there's a realistic thought experiment, then you create meaningful clarity and clarification, whereas if you make it so unrealistic that you pay attention to the wrong details, you lose the value, right? You start like it's, I don't know if you've ever seen, and I'll let you speak, David, but I don't know if you've ever seen to the guy juggling balls video, like where you basically are shown a picture of a guy juggling balls and you're asked to count how many times did he throw the ball up. And you're sitting there counting the balls, and then it's like, all right, he juggled 52 times. Is that right? Is that right? And then they go, yes, or you know, no, but like that's not the point. Now watch the video again and just pay attention and see if you and then you're asked like, did you notice anything weird in the video? And then the answer is no, I didn't see anything weird. Like, you know, 52 times that the ball moved. And then they go, here's the same video again. Tell me if you notice anything weird. They play the video. A guy in an ape suit walks in front of the person juggling the balls and goes around them. And when you're paying so much attention to the juggling balls, you don't even notice the guy in the ape suit. No one noticed it in the whole classroom, right? But then when they showed it afterwards, we're like, oh my God, we were distracted by the irrelevant details and we missed the main story that was going on, which happens in our news all the time. Like, you know, they'll publish a news article at a time that they don't want you to see some really important news going on, and the news will distract you from the real thing that's going on, and it just frustrates the heck out of me. So, but I'm sorry, David, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to get that out and I would forget.
No, that gorilla is pretty funny. It's a good example of, but as Steve, I think, pointed out earlier, and Carrie as well, that a good thought experiment doesn't have to really be realistic as long as it's very clear. All the assumptions are clarified, and then the variable that's of interest is then dealt with. But the thought experiment has to be very clear. Like, for instance, I remember when you were saying, well, you don't trust the unicorn. Well, if you said in the thought experiment, the unicorn may not be trusted or may not be 100% correct, that would have changed my answer. But because I didn't know that, I assumed the unicorn, you know, knew what it was talking about. You're going to spend eternity in hell. And so that's why I gave the answer that I did, because I think I gave the human answer that everyone would actually do if you were faced with a high enough cost for whatever ethical dilemma you're facing.
I would argue, David, that if we all knew with 100% certainty that what the unicorn said was true, we would all torture the people. But
there you go. That, well,
point,
yes,
the whole point, and
exactly,
that's the whole point of the thought experiment, is that that's the wrong answer. Like, because there is always uncertainty in life, and we never really know, even if we've seen something that we can't explain to date.
Wait a minute. That thought experiment clarified human behavior. It's not the wrong answer. You've given a thought experiment. What it clarified is what humans do. And you can't say, well, that's wrong. Humans do the wrong thing. You have to say, so given that humans, if the cost is high enough, humans will be unethical. That's the conclusion, not nothing else.
I would disagree with that. But like, why do you think that, like, wouldn't you agree that there's like a level of uncertainty in like anything that we perceive in life? Like, isn't there always a level of uncertainty? Like,
but you have to,
I don't even know that I exist. I might be a figment of my own imagination, right? Like, I doubt everything.
A good thought experiment includes any relevant information to the situation at hand. And I would argue that should have been included. You can't qualify every thought experiment by saying, but we don't really know anything for sure. Like, that thought experiments, you say what the assumptions are, what the situation is, and you don't bring in anything else and say, wow, but don't forget, overall, we never know anything for sure.
Well, there's always judgment that's brought in to the thought experiment, and there's always a level of uncertainty.
No, see, that's a bad thought experiment. You can't have uncertainty. You have to have clarity.
That's untrue.
You can have, you can have a thought experiment dealing with uncertainty, but in a situation where you say the trolley or whatever, you can't say, well, you don't know if the trolley wheels are going to fall off, so maybe you won't actually kill anyone if it turns, the wheels might fall off. And, like, you can't bring these additional qualifications in, like, we don't know that the unicorn is telling the 100% truth. You're assuming it, you said it's magic, and you said you'll go to hell. You got to assume the unicorn knows what it's talking about. Unless
I said the unicorn says you will go to hell. I didn't say that the unicorn is always 100% right, because
okay. I mean, you implied it.
It was intentionally written in a way that could cause someone to come to the wrong conclusion. It was contrived to be a thought experiment that leads us to the wrong conclusion, because the assumptions of the thought experiment are so unrealistic that they will lead you to the wrong conclusion.
Unrealistic or not sufficiently well defined, which I think is David's point.
I think I defined everything clearly, but there was a level of doubt that was left. And the question is whether or not someone, will follow the logical conclusion and, to just assume that everything that seems to be happening on its face, should I assume that that's the reality, or should I have that level of doubt and my trust in my innate sense of right and wrong?
Well, no, I think
I agree with David on
the test in that scenario of the unicorn was, would you spend eternity in hell in order not to be ethical? Or in order to be ethical, would you spend eternity in hell? To me, that was the question you were asking.
No, the question was whether or not you would torture all the people you thought were ethical.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly.
And I didn't say necessarily that you will definitively spend eternity in hell. I said that a magical unicorn, which proved that it was highly powerful and could do things that you couldn't otherwise explain. Now, mind you, David, magicians have done things you couldn't otherwise explain either, because I don't think you know how they do their tricks.
You can't start weaseling like that. That's a bad thought experiment. As Steve is pointing out, you have to kind of, box.
To be fair, I think what he's saying is he left an intentional ambiguity as part of the clear definition. And David perhaps didn't see it as an ambiguity and just read it. It's the interpretation of the question. I think
I'm not judging you,
we
David,
would
for your
all
answer.
agree
Like, I
that
think
the
your answer
utility
was actually, I agree with you, given what a normal logical person might believe was the logical implication of what I said. I agree with you that that's what is the logical conclusion if you follow logic without trusting your innate sense of right and wrong. So, yeah.
But I'd just say that the fault with it is that the unicorn, it does say convinces you with all the miracles that he produces for your benefit. He convinces you. So it's the essence is in the word convince, because now you 100% believe him to be real. So that's
convinces you that it is extremely powerful.
I think we might
not
all
necessarily
agree
that it can put you in hell.
I think
But
we
the
might
implication is that it will. It can.
It convinces you. It convinces you. So there's no longer a delusion or a doubt. It convinces you. So that's all around that word convince.
It convinces you that it's extremely powerful, and it is. And in the thought experiment, I'm not going against that.
Convinces you, it just becomes another trolley car problem because you're convinced. You take the hypothetical delusion element out of it because you are convinced, I would argue.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah.
I think we might all agree that the utility in a thought experiment is the clarity of its definition.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I don't think that saying that an ant drew a picture of Winston Churchill, like that doesn't create clarity for me. Like, that creates lack of clarity. What are the chances that an ant is ever going to draw a picture of Winston Churchill into the sand? Like,
isn't the question, is it a picture? Not what are the chances of it, but what it's about the definition of a picture. Is it a picture if it unintentionally did it? I thought that was the crux of it.
It is, but if like that is a completely unrealistic thing, then what? Like, it doesn't make sense to ask if it's a picture or not if the scenario could never come about in the first place. And that's where, like, I think my example of the piece of abstract art is more pertinent, which is like, if someone creates abstract art with this purpose and someone sees that abstract art and gets totally the opposite from it or just something different from it, does the piece of art have an innate, impact on an individual? And the answer is very clearly no in that scenario, because the artist meant something different than the person that perceived it. And then it creates a clear example that art is subject to interpretation by a person looking at it. And then if you take that and apply it to the ant thing, which again, I don't love the ant example, but you can just say, look, if I'm looking at the picture of Winston Churchill in the sand, whether the ant meant it to be there or not, I, as an interpreter of the sand, I think it looks like Winston Churchill. So yeah, it's a picture of Winston Churchill. And that clarifies that there really is no lack of clarity in the question. The perception of the art is in the interpreter. And, it's and it creates a clear answer to it's, to me, not even an intellectually interesting question anymore once you put it in realistic terms.
But it's a similar thing with, if an accumulation, I know other people got their hands up, I'll be very brief. If there's an accumulation of pebbles on a beach that form the perfect sentence, say, for instance, there is nothing new under the sun, perfectly formed sentence. Is it a sentence? It's just a result of the tide washing the pebbles up into perfect formation. Is it a sentence? It's all about the observer and the interpretation.
There are 3 hands up, by the way.
Okay.
Well,
oh, good on you.
Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is the first time I've attended this group. I'm very much enjoying the conversation. I think I came to it through a cross-referenced group. So if you wouldn't mind sticking the meetup link for your originating group in the chat, I would appreciate
I will do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a series of links. And actually, I want to thank you for reminding me. I also want to put next week's event in the chat so that people can sign up for that. Yeah, I'll do that as well. But the link that I just put in is a bunch of links about the FTI. And thank you for the kind words, by the way, Steve. We want this to be interesting. We welcome feedback from everybody. So anyone that has complaints that hasn't left yet, please send them to me. I'll put my email in, and we always want feedback. You know, our purpose as an organization is to facilitate personal growth and development, and we want events that do that for everybody. So and hopefully they're intellectually interesting along the way. Carrie, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think the conversation that we've been witnessing is exactly why these thought experiments are good. I mean, the unicorn problem, right? It identified unjustified assumptions made by David, right? He made assumptions that magic means infallible and should be trusted, right? In the course of, now, these things, yes, you can read them, right? But if the author isn't guiding you through, you're going to lose some utility. And I think that there's a certain aspect of these things that one of the reasons they really work well in a classroom environment is because you have an instructor who, through Socratic questioning, and can kind of guide you to at least identify what the issues are. Like in the case of the unicorn, is the unicorn infallible? Does convince, what are we convinced of? The truth of the matter? Or just that the unicorn is powerful? I mean, I know, you know, in the course of philosophical debate, it seems like, you know, the major challenge is agreeing on definitions and how the problems are even situated in the first place. After that, most people agree on everything except maybe the big points. But I think it's actually, you know, in spite of the fact that there's a lot of banter going back and forth, I think every one of these examples we've identified exactly where the hinge points are for coming up with the way to analyze the problem correctly. And I mean, the thing with the ant, I mean, the beauty of that example is that we all understand that even though the ant's alive, it does not have artistic intention, right? As opposed to, as soon as you throw an artist in there, now it gets a little more complicated, and you've added an extra variable, and now it's, are we meeting? We're having a meeting of the minds in terms of the artist's intention versus the perceiver's intention, as opposed to the ant that has no intention and it's this random event. Sure, they could have said, you're walking along and you see a cloud that looks like a duck. Is it a representation of a duck, right? You do the same thing. But again, the mechanism almost doesn't matter. You're supposed to just accept that as the basis for the analysis and the conversation to launch from.
Thank you. I agree completely, Carrie, in that I think it's been a very interesting conversation from my perspective, and I appreciate everyone humoring me in my in my own thought experiment, and shooting holes in it. It made it more clear for me, like why like, yeah, it created more clarity for me than I had even before I presented it, just from the dialogue, which is what I love about these events, is I learn from them even if I'm presenting, and I like that. By the way, it looks like our next week is not our next week's event is not posted. I'm behind in having the events get posted, so I want to ask, I think actually it might be good to do Israel Palestine next week, and then I want to do free will and determinism, which I think I'll do around the end of December. And so if people have other events that they want to, topics that they want covered, feel free to email me. If we haven't already covered them and have videos up on YouTube about them, or have YouTube videos coming up about them at some point, then we'll do them. The free will one, I think, got lost in the ether. So that said, Charles hasn't spoken yet and has his hand up. So Charles, go ahead.
Oh, hi there. Actually, Kerry sort of answered what I was going to say, but I was just going to explore the variables of the ant one by saying you could frame it in such a way that imagine the stars were in such an arrangement where you could draw a lion in it. Would that be a picture? But I think you're right, Kerry. It sort of doesn't that spin on it doesn't quite test it enough. That just means more people. That just means lots of people have seen the picture of Winston Churchill that the ant's drawn. Maybe anyway. I just thought that was just a twist on it. I don't know whether that's good or not.
I think it works as an example as well. But again, I guess the point is it's supposed to be a little bit over the top, as opposed to a lot of people, they have a preconceived notion about constellations. There's historical references and whatnot, but it does get to the same point ultimately is where does the image and the perception lie?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Charles, for the comment and question. Anyone have other questions, or does anyone have a preference? Go ahead.
I just put a link there in the chat for you, Garrett. I should have sent it personally. That's a debate between Professor Robert Sapolsky and Professor Kevin someone, a recent debate, because they've both written the book. So I guess you're referring to determinism and free will because it's all the rage now since Sapolsky wrote that book, Determined. He's a hardline determinist. It's quite fascinating, biological determinism, because none of us asked to be born in the first place.
Well,
okay. I know you're going to say maybe we do, but many would say that's pretty. They don't agree with that. But we don't ask to be here. If you accept we don't ask to be here, but suddenly we're in this game that we have to play. Philosophically, that's very interesting. Like, what are our obligations anyway? I didn't even ask to be born. However, I'll put the link in the chat, which is Professor Sapolsky debating another professor who's got the exact opposite view. And they have a really good debate, and they both present their cases clearly. So I thought maybe you could use that as a precursor to the actual discussion next Tuesday. Instead of a reading material, people just watch that debate. You'll know everything you need to know about it just from watching the debate. That's just a suggestion.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'll put it in the chat. It'll probably be the 26th of December that we talk about determinism versus free will. I'll put that as background if people want to watch it. I read the arguments of Sapolsky's book, and he makes the same argument that Sam Harris makes, which is to assume that cause and effect are deterministic, which is basically putting the cart before the horse. It's basically assuming the premise, it's a circular argument. So unfortunately, that's not a safe assumption. And if you want to make that assertion, you have to prove it. And I don't think they can, because I can prove the opposite is true. And so,
can you though?
My claim, and I'll present that claim on the 26th. But next week, I think we'll talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict, because it's very, current and deep, and there's a lot of anger, hate, and frustration about that topic. And so I'd like to open some dialogue about. I'm gonna cheekily, as I often do, title it Israel-Palestine, Who Should We Side With? And you'll find that I don't think we should side with anyone.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many people are jumping on board. That's one of the things I noticed with this whole thing about the human predisposition to pick a side.
Right.
Just pick a side, and then the other side's wrong. They're both committing atrocities.
Which I don't want to get into. Sean is right. Side with peace is exactly what I think, and side with love and compassion. And that's what I'm going to try to make an argument for next Tuesday. So hopefully you guys can come, and hopefully we can try to share that message with some folks that'll come that are probably very angry and frustrated, which people have a right to be angry and frustrated. I don't want to diminish the pain, anger, and frustration that anyone has felt from this. But I do want to say that killing more people is not the solution to any of it, in my opinion, unless we want to wipe someone off the face of the earth, which, is what some people want to do. So, Carrie, go ahead. I don't mean to get into the Israel-Palestine thing this week. Let's save that for next week. We will have plenty of time, and just keep an eye out for it. If people are not on our mailing list, if you sign up to the mailing list, we will add you to a Google group, which will put this on your calendar invite every week. And so for regulars that want to have it on their calendar blocked, I have a regular calendar invite that I send out to people that are members of the mailing list, which we never email anything pretty much. I just don't have time, and I don't have enough volunteers right now, but would love to add it to people's calendars so that you can join and join us each week that you're able to make it.
Yeah.
So just to make it easy for you. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask you where the link is for the Discord group.
The Discord link is in, I'll put the link again with all the link of links. Like, I have one Google Doc that I used to post like 4 links, but now I have one Google Doc that has the links to everything.
Okay.
And the Discord is in there as well. If you go to freethinkerinstitute.org, it also has the Discord very prominently. Like, we try to point people to Discord because I'd like to get more conversations going there. We can continue this conversation. We have a channel there for Tuesday night conversations where we can continue this conversation there. People can bring up whatever topics they want. It's a very intellectually interesting community. We just need to get some people asking questions and making comments, and then people will join in. But I want to encourage everyone to talk, between these events on Tuesday evenings, because there's really good dialogue there when it's active. It's just not as active as I'd like. So I want to encourage people to be active there. It's a good way to stay in touch. All I will say is if things get heated, go to voice chat, because tone of voice says a lot more than words. And I like to joke that text communication is the worst way to communicate. And so if communication is not going well via text, go into voice chat. And you can very easily do that with Discord. Just say jump to voice chat, and then you click on the voice chat channel and you can talk to each other. And almost all the frustrating text conversations I have, once I go to voice chat, they get resolved. So David, go ahead.
Just a quick note about news. Before the internet and maybe before television, most of what you knew about happened directly around you, so that if something negative was going on, it was right in front of you and you could actually do something about it. Now, with the internet and television and all the rest, there's remote negative stuff going on that you can do nothing about except know about it. And I think this is psychologically stressful, or maybe part of the reason a lot of people feel stressed out about the world and the condition of the world. I still hold, despite the fact that there's bad things going on, in a big picture, long-term view, things are still getting better, but it's hard to believe that when you look at CNN. So I think in the old days, when we were cavemen and a little beyond that, if something negative was happening around you, you would actually be physically partaking in the negating that negative thing going on. And now we're kind of handcuffed. All we do is read about it, see it in the TV and stuff. And, we can't actually, it's not right there that we can do something. So I think that's stressful. That's all I have to say.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. And actually, David, it was mind-blowingly shocking to me when I read a summary of Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, where he made a pretty good statistically based argument that we live in the safest, healthiest, wealthiest world that humanity has ever known. Because if you watch the news, it looks like the sky is falling every single freaking day, and we're all going to die, we're all going to die, we're all going to die. Wait a minute, hold on, which one is right? Well, Steven's got a lot of statistics on his side. He's well-grounded, and he doesn't make money for selling eyeballs, whereas the news does make money for selling eyeballs. And so we're being tricked by the news into thinking this world is a horrible, horrible place. And how could we even step outside? We should suck on a Cheerio for sustenance under our kitchen tables all day and just hope we don't just get invaded by a criminal who's going to, kill us. Like, it's not that bad, people. Like, and we can make it better. But the way we make it better is by knowing that we're in a good spot. But there are also a lot of communities where things are unsafe. And how do we make those communities better and safer rather than living in fear and thinking that this is a horrible world? We want to make things better. And, so that said, I appreciate you bringing that up, David. That's a whole nother series of events. And Ginny had a good suggestion of talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. So we'll add that to the list because that's another one. We actually talked about that before Russia invaded Ukraine. And we did a really interesting event where we read right-wing news, left-wing news, and centrist news about the Russia-Ukraine saber rattling that was going on. And people really liked that event. I'd love to have another conversation about it. I've gotten into some Facebook arguments over that war. So over both wars, to be frank. So anyway, Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, one of the features of advertising, if they've got you thinking about Coke or Pepsi, they've already won the battle, right? Because you're not thinking of all of these other alternatives like orange juice, water, milk, nothing, right? They've got you on this dichotomy, this false dilemma. And I would argue that it's gotten more confusing, but in terms of accessibility of information, it's way better now than it was. I mean, before the mainstream media had a lock on the narrative and where the boundaries of the conversation were. And now with alternative reporting, people on the ground saying, hey, I'm not seeing this, I'm seeing this other thing over here. I mean, if you're willing to do a deep dive, boy, it's an amazing time to analyze what the mainstream media is trying to tell us and then analyze why. And I mean, that brings you to a whole nother world, but we'll save that for the future conversations. But yeah, I can't wait. That sounds like fun.
Thanks, Carrie. Anyone else have other items that they wanted to talk about or other ideas for events? We've gotten a bunch tonight. And I'm just trying to keep up with them. I have to get the next couple of events posted. I'll try to get that done in the next day or two. But for now, please sign up to the mailing list and I'll add you. I have to add people manually. I haven't automated the add to the mailing list, so you won't get added right away, but you'll get added to a Google group within a day or two of signing up to the mailing list. I have to add you to the Google group, which will invite you to the calendar invites on Tuesday evenings. Anyone have other items that they wanted to talk about or topics that they... Go ahead.
Where is your paper on free will again? Is it in the Discord channel?
It is in Discord, but let me post it here. It is the most well-vetted paper that I've ever written. I wrote it, the original version, in, 2007. Since then, a PhD has published a paper trying to tie Gödel's incompleteness theorem to free will, although I think he did it totally wrong. But I was the first one to do that I'm aware of. But someone has done it since I did it, and I shared it pretty broadly, including to a free will expert. And so it's gotten a little traction in academia, but I haven't looked for places to publish it. I haven't looked for places to publish anything, although I probably want to do that at some point. What I'm trying to do now, to be honest, is like take all of the essays that I have and put them into a ChatGPT, like a Free Thinker Institute ChatGPT, so that for anyone that wants to geek out on philosophy and try to hear like a well thought out perspective on a wide variety of topics, you'll be able to like interact with a ChatGPT that has all the contents of my essays, and you can like inquire about them. So I think that would be pretty cool. So I'm trying to work on that, but it'll probably take another month or so to get it done.
What about collating them all into a book?
That's what I'm gonna like. So I'm actually writing a book on the Free Thinker Institute. It's about the 5 intentions. I have a group that I'm working with on that. So there will be a Free Thinker Institute book coming out. and then I would like to publish a series of essays like after that. But you know, I have to do one at a time. I only have so much time for editing. So the first one that I thought was the most valuable was the 5 intentions. And so we haven't done an event on the 5 intentions for a really long time. Maybe I could just like mention it real quick if people want to know the common values of the organization. Would that be interesting to people since we don't have hands up? I got one hand up. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I think the 5 intentions are a great series of mileposts by which to lead your life. And they're not hard, they're not difficult, but they're very wise. And I think having a meeting on them would be very beneficial.
Thanks. I've actually evolved them a little bit since the last time we talked about it. So I think it would be probably time to do another event on them. So I'll do that. I need to let me put the argument for free will. I won't include the one on determinism because it's a little cheeky. It's my most rude paper, not intentionally rude, but I realized like I make a comparison of how determinism basically requires more faith, more blind faith in the laws of physics than medieval man had in omniscient and omnipotent God. And so that's a little bit of a cheeky comparison, but when I realized, like, I was a staunch determinist, by the way, before I took the computer science class that I learned about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and then I realized Gödel basically proved determinism wrong as soon as I learned about the theorem. And so I went about trying to prove Gödel wrong, and well, Gödel won. So turns out I was wrong, and free will, I think, is right. So I'll make that argument later on in December, but I put the essay in the chat for anyone that wants to read it or add comments. There is one part that I need to explain better in the essay. I need to go back. I've tried to explain it really well, but I for some reason it still is a sticking point for people. So I'm hoping that at the event I can understand what confuses people about it, and I can try to think of a way to explain it better through the conversation and dialogue we have after the presentation. I will say the presentation takes a long time, so it'll probably be on the longer side, like an hour, not 20 minutes like tonight, but it's a pretty involved argument, but I know it pretty well, so I might be able to do it faster, but I also want it to be something that people can follow. Actually, I think when it took an hour, we were taking questions along the way because we used to do that. And that's when people had trouble following the argument. So maybe it'll be shorter. We'll see. But anyway, anyone have other questions or topics that they wanted to cover? Wait, what was the one I didn't write down? What was the one that we just talked about? Not free will. There was another one that someone proposed. Oh, the 5 intentions.
Ukraine?
5 intentions and the Ukraine. So thank you. Thank you. When I'm focused on the event, I have even a worse memory than my normally very bad memory. So anyone have any other items? We're rounding out about 9 o'clock, and I think we're.
Didn't you mention something about Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, next week we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, and the title will be Israel and Palestine, who's right? Who do we side with? Which is flippant because I don't think we should side with either side. I think we should for a solution and peace in the Middle East. I'm a big believer in peace in the Middle East. My first event this year is now up on YouTube for anyone who wants the secret to world peace. I got it. I got one of those. As Monty Python and the Holy Grail's saying goes, I come in search of the Holy Grail. We've already got one, and I've already got a solution to peace on earth. So you can listen to it and see if it has merit to you. I think it does. I joke about it, but I do think that it actually is a viable solution to peace on earth that will reduce human rights violations as well as creating peace on Earth. It will require a commitment by the leaders of the free world, but hopefully someday we'll get that commitment and see Earth become more peaceful. So yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
What would be the focus on the Ukraine Russia topic?
I think like the typical debate that I hear is you know, why are we supporting the Ukraine so much? Why are we putting so much money in? And so I guess the question will be, should we be continuing to support the Ukraine you know, financially and militarily? You know, should we have at all, you know, and like what's the right course of action? It'll be a real life thought experiment. Like, what should we do in this situation? And I have thought a lot about this, and I have a well-formulated opinion like I often do, but I welcome feedback to the contrary, as I always do, which, by the way, I stand corrected on the Milgram experiments. From what I can tell, I don't know where I got the $4,000. I might have like misread 4.00 as 4,000 somehow. I don't know, like, because it was originally $4 and then 50 cents of car fare. And so I might have been a decimal off or read it too quickly, or maybe, you know what it might have been? It might have been that it was like a really old document that I was reading and the decimal wasn't clear. And it was 400. And then I put it into modern USD dollars and then it was 4,000. My guess is that that's, you know, that's what it was, is it went from 400 to 4,000 in modern USD dollars. So, but it was 450 that the Milgram experiment people were paid. So I stand corrected on that. And this shows you that when I'm wrong, I admit I'm wrong very quickly. I did a quick fact check and I have no problem admitting I'm wrong. My goal is to seek truth, not to be right. Like, confirmation bias, in my opinion, is the enemy of mankind. So
I was going to wonder where he got the funding at that. I mean,
yeah, I know.
Cost $1 million.
Yeah, it would have been really expensive, right? Yeah, I should have like double checked it for that reason, Carrie, because it didn't pass the smell test. And normally, like, you know, but now I'm going to have to go back and think about the Milgram experiments again. Now in modern day dollars, that's about $45. So it's not a significant, you know, for a really poor person, maybe, but it's not a significant. But now I'm really worried about humanity following authority so easily. Like, we really, it's even more important that we spread the 5 intentions, which is about learning to trust your own judgment rather than other people's judgment, and learning to hone your critical thinking skills, because, you know, that blind followership is really dangerous. It led to a bunch of fake electrocutions in the Milgram experiments, and it led to the Inquisitions in medieval Spain and lots of other, you know, the Salem witch trials and lots of other injustice that I do think that, you know, we could have prevented if we had more critical thinkers in those time periods. But we were too late for them, but we're not too late for the future. So, Carrie.
Yeah, it reminds me, there was a friend of mine just read me a section of a book he has on the history of AI. But there was a section in there where this person kind of does a deep dive into the funding of the author of the leading hypothesis of something about how our brains work. And it was something that Lisa Feldman Barrett, in her book on, you know, how intentions are made, contradicts. And it ends up, this guy was funded by the precursor to DARPA. And it was just the weirdest thing. I did not see it coming. And it was like, what the hell? Why is the CIA getting involved in funding brain research? I mean, I know why, but it was like, you know, whenever you look at funding, it's a question, you know, worth following that road and trying to see. You know, the question asked sometimes presupposes the answer you're going to get, you know, and
yeah, the questions are the important part, right? Like, and following the money is really, really important. There's a great company called the Sunlight Foundation that watches government, you know, government representatives, who they vote for and how much funding they get from where, which is a lot harder to do now that there's so much dark money in politics because it's legal to bribe government officials these days. But I mean, give them free speech, which is unlimited amounts of money, which is considered free speech. Yeah, really important to follow the money and see where that funding is coming from. And yeah, when we look at the CIA, like, they're not elected representatives, but our elected representatives did retroactively legalize spying on US citizens when Mr. Snowden had to run to Russia to stay safe from the US government for calling out the fact that the US government was illegally spying on citizens. That's something that we should all be upset about. We should do another event on that, although then I may really not I may really disappear. So anyway, hope everybody has a great rest of your night. We're going to close out now. Thanks everyone for the great conversation, and hope you all will come see us next week and have more good conversation and ask more great questions. And thanks for everyone coming in, and hope you all have a great rest of your night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.